Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on back to school strategies for remote learning for students with ASD. My name is Brittany Boston, and I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and I will be the facilitator for today's webinar. So before I hand it over to Nikki for the content, I do want to take care of a few housekeeping items. As participants on today's webinar, you are in listen-only mode. However, we have a small group with us, so please feel free to engage in any way that you can, either through putting in comments or questions in your chat or questions box, or even raising your hand if you have a working microphone, and I will be happy to unmute you and have you communicate with us that way as well. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ICSPS website and the ADA website for later review as well. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Nikki to get us into today's webinar.
Excellent. Thank you, Brittany. Good morning, everybody. I hope you are doing well on this Tuesday morning. Thank you for joining us for Back to School Strategies for Remote Learning for Students with Autism. I think we're all kind of immersing ourselves in this new world. This seems to be very much uncharted territory for all of us. And I know that many of us have spent a lot of time thinking about the needs of our teachers as well as the needs of our students, and really trying to come up with ideas that can be used in the classroom as well as to support students as we navigate these new routines that we are all learning right now. It's also important that we come up with these new routines and teach our students why all of these changes are happening and why there's lots of new routines in our daily schedules. Again, thank you everyone for attending today. We know this is an incredibly busy time for everyone, and we really do appreciate you taking a little bit of time to learn about this topic that is very relevant and important to all of us. So very quickly, here are some of the things that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about some of the challenges, and like Brittany said, we are a small group, so if you guys want to hop off your microphone and talk, I really want to know what your challenges are. I know ones that I've talked to a lot of teachers lately, and they've shared what their challenges are, but I want to know what your challenges are. And so we're going to talk about those challenges that are associated with teaching students with autism and other developmental disabilities under all of these new guidelines that we seem to be living in and that have presented themselves for this upcoming school year. We're also going to identify some tips and tricks that can be used, hopefully, to meet some of these challenges. And then many of us are faced with new types of schedules, new ways of delivering instruction, like remote learning, or maybe a hybrid model. And so these are all different ways that we're now providing instruction. And so we're going to talk about what we can do to help meet some of these new needs, as our classrooms and the way that we're developing and delivering instruction looks very different than what they did just over a year ago. We're also going to talk about some evidence-based teaching strategies or evidence-based practices that we can use to support learners on the autism spectrum. So first of all, I want to start off, how are you beginning your school year? Brittany, do you want to pull over the poll?
Yeah, so I'm going to pop a poll up here, and then I'll give you some options to answer. Give it a few more seconds here. All right, we'll go ahead and share the results.
All right, it looks like the majority of us are, well, it's kind of split. 50% are virtual, remote instruction, and then it looks like there are a handful of you that are in person and that hybrid model and virtual. So that is a huge new thing to navigate. Does anybody want to hop on the microphone and share what that looks like for you? Because I know we're going to talk about what that looks like. I have some outlines, but what does that look like for you and how is it going?
And if you want to go ahead and either type in the chat or raise your hand, and I will be happy to unmute you.
All right, well, I'll move right ahead and we can talk about those different formats in a moment. All right, as we are entering a school year unlike any before, we are all experiencing lots of different challenges. Like we just saw, many of you are still in your buildings, but it is truly a very different school year. It looks very different. There's probably not everyone in your school building, and obviously how students are coming in and what your school day looks like is very, very different. Many of you are engaging in remote learning or providing your instruction in a virtual environment, which is a whole new way to teach and a very difficult way to teach. Those of us who have been working with students with disabilities for years have many tools in our toolbox, but we might feel like we may feel that we're not able to use a lot of those tools that we've had to meet our students' needs in the same way. It's almost like we're a fish out of water. And for those of you that are in person, I'd love to hear what you're thinking of related to social distancing. That's a challenge. How do you provide to meet the same level of need for and support for your student while maintaining social distancing? And for many students who are still meeting physically in a classroom, how do we explain these new guidelines for social distancing, and how do we teach these new rules and know that your students are understanding them? So that's a huge challenge. Also, as we talked about, there's lots of different new scenarios on what that school day looks like and on different types of schedules. As I mentioned, I've worked with a variety of different schools and teachers, and every day I feel like I hear about a new schedule or a different situation. And so no classroom or school or district is the same. And many places are offering very different options. Even in some schools, some students are attending in person and some students are attending remotely. That's what's happening in my own children's district. My kids are remote, but I know there are some of their classrooms for students who have different needs to be sure that they're meeting those IEP goals. Some students are meeting face-to-face. For instance, they have kids coming in and meeting from 8:30 to 11:30, I think, almost daily. Maybe there's a Wednesday that they stay home, but then they're also remote in the afternoon. So that takes a lot of planning, and I'm sure is very stressful because we're not only planning for that in-person, face-to-face instruction, but then we also have to engage students in a remote setting, whether that's synchronous or asynchronous. So there's a huge variety of schedules that teachers and families are navigating right now. It's wild. In addition to teachers and educational staff being overwhelmed, so are families as well as caregivers. I know for me as a working mom, trying to navigate my own responsibilities as well as supporting my youngest kiddo who really needs to have somebody by his side all the time, that's really difficult. And so this is a whole new role that families are tasked with as trying to be a teacher or a teaching assistant to support remote learning in that home environment while they're also navigating their own work roles. So with that being said, there's also childcare settings that are being hit really hard, and they're experiencing new schedules and very different roles to accommodate all of these different e-learning schedules. Were there any schedules or any challenges just in the physical aspect of how we're providing instruction that I did not include in here that you can think of?
So Nikki, we did have a couple of comments coming through. We had one
Awesome.
individual saying that it's going surprisingly well so far. They have had some people drop out, but they are in week 3 and it's going well so far.
Beautiful. And is that for K through 12 system? Or is that higher ed? College. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing.
Then we also had another comment. As a mother of a college-age student with ASD, it has been difficult already for my son. He is in an all online math class plus a once a week face-to-face 1-hour class to go over questions and give extra help. But when my son has trouble understanding the materials, as happens in math, he gives up and gets mad. Then he takes the quiz online, which is difficult for him, and bombs it. Then he continues to be in a bad mood and wants to give up. Any suggestions for how to reduce the anger and get back to learning?
Yeah, that's really hard, especially with some of these abstract classes. The first thing I would say is, has he reached out to his instructor? And have you connected with the instructor to talk about some of these frustrations? Because I know the professors may not be aware of some of these struggles, especially when we have some learning challenges on top of taking some of these, tests or trying to engage with the content. So I would say that's probably your first step, is reaching out to the instructor, but then also making sure you're accessing your student access and supports offices, just to make sure that any accommodations can be provided. But I think it might go back to also really connecting with that instructor, because on the back end, I know when I teach my college classes, there's settings that I can set up if it's a timed thing, or I can put accommodations into those platforms that I'm using. So it might be worth having a conversation with the instructor to see what accommodations can be provided while accessing the content. And please, we can talk a little bit more about this later. So thank you for sharing some of those challenges. There's a lot of them right now. And I think for the most part, things are going really well. However, it is incredibly difficult. So we'll talk hopefully about some things that we can do to help support some of these challenges as we go forward. And with that, change is hard. Even though the school year has started, it's looking very different for all of us. And we know that change is hard for each one of us, but it's especially hard for our students on the spectrum and learners with disabilities, as they often don't like change and have been out of a school setting since March. So we have 6 months of a different way that instruction has been provided. If it has been provided, I know that March through June for my own kids looked very, very different. I do have a child who has an IEP, and I can say that his services looked very different over those few months. And so starting back in August has been, a huge challenge and change. And he is a kiddo that really responds better to in person. So we're doing the best we can with the resources and supports that we have, and being very flexible in what that looks like for him. And then I'll talk about some of the other supports that we have put in place that have helped be a little bit more successful. So the return to school right now in August or September, whenever you have returned, is going to be challenging in and of itself. So we have to use all of the strategies in our toolboxes that we know work with students with autism to be successful. So we'll talk a little bit about what those are and what that might look like. The other part that's been really hard is the social distancing and teaching social distancing. And when we think about social distancing in our schools, some of the things that we need to be consider, which I know many of you are probably already doing, and some of these things aren't even in your control as your district makes some of these decisions, but all of these different alternate schedules. I know that was something that a lot of our teachers came together based on the needs of their students and said, hey, we have to have face-to-face instruction as we know that that is the way that our students learn best. So because of that, the example that our scenario that I explained a little bit ago, some classrooms are meeting face-to-face while others are meeting remotely. Other ways that they have changed those schedules is they have staggered start times, and others are doing staggered schedules where some students might attend 2 days a week, 1 week, and then 3 days a week the next week, and then they flip-flop based upon the week. Schools are also putting measures into place to provide physical distance between students and teachers. And some schools are doing a really good job providing that support within the environment. How are we helping to socially distance? But then other times, it's left upon the teacher's shoulders, and the teachers are the ones who are being very creative about how they're using different materials in their classroom to create that physical distance within their classrooms or within the spaces that they're using to provide instruction right now. So that's been very, very interesting when I've been talking to teachers of how are they actually putting up, barriers, or what are they using within their classroom that are natural barriers so that they can divide and try to encourage socially distancing as much as possible. And it's been difficult. And this is very true of higher ed. I know a lot of you said that you are doing remote. I know our own local college here at ISU, they have pushed as many classes to be online as possible, but there are also still classes that are physically meeting. And so that looks very different even in a college setting. And it's been interesting to see how a lot of these classes that have been face-to-face have been transitioning to an online format, and including both synchronous as well as asynchronous, which are terms that we're all becoming very familiar with, formats. Our schools, when we think about school-wide activities, many of our schools have had to reimagine what that looks like. Some of the activities that we're used to, such as back to school night or fall festivals or other large gatherings on campus, are being reimagined. I am a faculty advisor for one of our student organizations. And so one of the big things that we do at the beginning of the semester for all of the student organizations is we have a big powwow out on the quad, and we invite students to come and learn about our RSO. But because of the socially distanced measures that are in place, we had to flip that to primarily be an online or virtual event. And then students signed up for time slots, and they came and they met with me. I had a table out on the quad, and they could come up one at a time to talk with me. We could not share pens. I had to type into my computer their email address. So it was a very different situation. But we made it work. We were very flexible in how we plan that. And so it just takes a lot of planning to reimagine what that looks like. We're also seeing that many schools who have commingling, so that would be inclusion, that would also be navigating school environments and switching classes. We have to take a look at what that looks like. And it looks very, very different for students. And we still have to consider how we're adjusting schedules so that students can get their needs met in those settings and still have time with typical peers, because that is so very important. I was talking with a parent just this past week who said her son has set up virtual bingo nights and virtual game nights with his friends, just so that they can still establish some of those typical things that they do in their schedule. So they are having remote Zoom nights. And so I was pretty excited about that, so that they could still maintain some of those social events that they enjoy doing. It's not the same, but it's something that they are doing so that they can continue to have that connection. So they're socializing remotely. And you can raise your hand. Are any of you familiar with this document? This is a document that I created back in April. We were asked by the Illinois State Board of Education to develop a resource for families. And really, I think this is a great tool for teachers as well, that really outlines what we can do to support students as we are navigating this remote learning. Is this document new to any of you who were on today's webinar? Yes, okay. I'm gonna take a second and share what this looks like. Hold on, I'm gonna pop out of the presentation really quick and hop over to the document. So the document we will share out, the document is on our ADA website. We will follow up with an email to you after the webinar, so you'll have access to this resource as well as to the PowerPoint as well as other materials. This document is on ISB's website as well, and just quickly to go over it, it does a quick introduction, but then it talks about how can we support students with autism. So some of the ways that we can are by supporting their understanding, and that might be explaining what coronavirus is, or it might be talking about why school looks different right now. It could be wearing a mask. Any of those things that we need to explicitly teach, we can do that by supporting their understanding using perhaps a social story. And social stories might look different for students at different ages. It might be a story or a page, a book that has, very limited words on it and more pictures to show a student, to teach them. Or it might be the opposite, where it's just a sheet of paper that has lots of different words, and I can be very creative in how I work with my older students when they've used social stories their entire life. However, it's not something that they may enjoy anymore. So I'll write a social story and then I'll hand it and I'll say, hey, can you edit this for me? Knowing that they're going to read it, but they're also gaining that information. And so that might be a way that you can use this type of tool to share information and teach about a certain concept, but being not sneaky in your delivery, but being smart in your delivery. So each one of these different bullets offer opportunities for expressive communication, establish a daily schedule and create routines, identify a location for remote learning or a work area, support behavior, socialize remotely, tips for remote learning, and then additional resources. Each one of these is included, has an area that defines what it means, describes information surrounding that topic, and then there is a link to a Google folder that has lots of different resources available in here, and I have been updating them pretty regularly. So this one here is an example. Here's a social story that talks about what is coronavirus, and this would be a resource that is in those folders. It also talks about offer opportunities for expressive communication. Oftentimes when there is change, we might see an increase in behavior. We know communication is so very important, and when stress levels increase and anxiety goes higher, we often see some interesting or challenging behavior. And whenever we see behavior, I always say think communication. At that moment in time, that individual may not have the ability to access their words or to use that formal communication system that they usually use. And so how can we provide support that will help them communicate? So if you're seeing behavior, always think communication and what can you do to support communication. That might be putting in place a I need help card. It might be using some more visual strategies to help support communication. And so you would want to offer support for expressive communication. Here are more examples. This is a snack choice board, but it's something that could be very helpful. I think probably one of the biggest things that you could do is establish a daily schedule and create routines. And this is going to look different based on each individual student's needs. One of the things that I think I found most helpful this semester, my children are all using Google Classroom and are a Google-based in a Google-based district. And so what I did, and I don't think it needs to happen only in Google, but using their calendar with their Google Calendar, and I use my Outlook calendar. I do this very similarly when I schedule my own stuff, but I put their daily schedule into their Google calendars. And so I put in from 7:45 to 8:15. They have a live, and I color coded. So live is green, and then in the location spot in the calendar, like the notes section, I went ahead and I posted where that live meeting link. So if it was like a Google Classroom or Google Meet, if it was a Google Meet, I would put the link in there. That way they could have their calendar open and just click and go to it. So it took a little bit of time, but for a teacher, you can do that and you can share that with each student. And so it only has to be developed one time, and then you can push that out to your students. That's one resource for that schedule. The schedule that we're using right now is a schedule that has a live links in it. So the schedule that I created is in their schedule in their Google Calendar, but the schedule that is being used by the teacher right now is just a Word document that has, I'm trying to pull one over for you. Hold on, it's not pulling up. Is just a Word document, and we work together. Okay, this is last Tuesday's, but I'm gonna see if I can pull it over. So it just has color coding. So anytime that it's yellow, that means it's a live classroom, and then she has instructions here on what happens the rest of the day. So this past Tuesday was considered an asynchronous day. So you see a lot of white, but those live colors are highlighted. And so that's been something that's been a huge support to us. And I worked with the teacher so that if mom is on a webinar doing a call, my kiddo knows what he needs to be doing and where he can independently navigate to get to where he needs to be. So I would say one of the first things that we can start with is building that schedule, because that also will help create routines. And so in the Google folder for creating a schedule, there are lots and lots of different examples of handwritten schedules, technologies that can be used, as well as tips on how to teach someone to use a schedule. And so I would say it's a great place to start if you haven't created a schedule yet. Identify a location for remote learning. And this one I think is really important, because we need to identify where is that work area going to be. It doesn't mean that work area needs to be in the same place every day, but do we have the schedule available? Do we have an area where it is there are minimal distractions so that the individual can engage in the learning? So for some people that might be at the dining room table. For me right now, I have one kid in my office with me because he needs that additional support. And then for my other children, they go between their desks within their room. They go down to where dad is working in the basement, and we have a little learning area where they can go if they need support when mom isn't available. But we have designated areas that allow them to do their work in. There's a whole area on how we can support behavior, and that ties and links right into reinforcement and what reinforcement systems we can put in place. Rules, I think rules are really important. One of the things that we've created right now is an online school rules chart. And so that is also up in those Google folders, but it talks about my eyes need to be on the teacher or the computer. I need to sit in my seat. My feet need to be on the floor. And that's another thing, taking into consideration seating for anyone who's working with younger children. We've put a little box underneath the desk so that feet can be grounded. It makes a world of difference when we can ground those feet. Other rules include voice is quiet and ears are listening, hands need to be down. So those are all things, and that of course can be individualized based on each of the learners' needs. Socialize remotely. I told you about Tyler and how he would set up these bingo nights or socialize I think he had Zoom meetings that were using Zoom. And so this is just a section on how we can socialize remotely. And then there's a whole couple pages on other tips that we can use. And so this is just a resource that is available to you, and you will have access to it after today's webinar. It is on the ICSPS website as well as the ADA website. So we will make sure that you have access to it if you don't already have access to it. So awesome. Any questions? All right, we'll move right along. Another resource that will be shared out is Teaching During COVID. So this is a document that not only it's for action planning. It pulls from information that public health guidelines have established so that we can be physically in a school setting. So it talks about all of the different considerations that teachers are already probably planning for instance, hygiene stations and what the layout of a classroom might look out like. So it takes into consideration all of those different guidelines, as well as some of the tips and tricks from that remote learning document. And it is used as a checklist. For instance, it talks about what will my schedule look like? How am I providing a schedule that my students can independently navigate and utilize? So this is a truly for team planning. It's not meant to be all inclusive. It's meant to be a discussion document on how are we going to do this and how does this meet the needs of the students that we're working with. So this will be another resource that is available to you. And we put it in a checklist format just so you can go through and make sure that you truly are meeting all of those local guidelines and doing what's best for all of the students. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things right now, because we know those guidelines are ever changing and changing frequently, but we still need to make sure that we are meeting the needs of our students in the best ways that we can. So I think this is a good tool to be able to use with your team to help you consider as many things as possible as you are planning all of your different ways to engage students. Okay, so moving on to some tips and tricks. The first one, be flexible. As we mentioned so many times, we are in uncharted waters. Our plans may not play out how we truly anticipated or how we want them to be. And what has worked in the past, what has worked last year, we have to be open to it may not work right now. So the best thing that we can do this year is being willing to change, to be flexible, to be willing to think out of the box and not get stuck on one strategy or idea that might not work. So we have to be flexible. So that's the first tip or trick. The second one, as mentioned, is don't compare this year to previous years. This year is going to be different in so many different ways. And it's really easy to compare to previous years. And that might help us contribute to feeling unsuccessful and like you're not doing enough. The pandemic and the school schedule is truly not in our control. And so we really need to try to not compare. I was talking to one of my good friends last night who was saying she did her weekly planning and now she felt so behind because this time last year she had her entire year planned out. And so that's something that's not in our control right now, because I know the time that it's taking for teachers to develop how they are sharing instruction right now. And so it's taking so much more time to develop content and to get it in this new format to be able to be delivered to students. So we truly can't compare where we are right now to where we were in past years. Our goal really needs to focus on progress and not perfection. So moving on, another tip and trick is differentiate, which is really kind of interesting in an online format. So we are, as special ed teachers, we are experts at differentiating. So this also might be second nature to many of us. But what we need to do is we need to find a schedule and establish what works for each student and his or her family and be flexible in that. There is no one size fits all solution right now. And so that differentiating to meet different families' needs is probably going to help us out significantly. We also need to be open to new ideas and things that we've never tried before. And some of the best ideas might come from suggestions that families might have. And so being open to listening, being flexible and differentiating will get us probably far, or hopefully will. So another one is utilize preference assessments for everyone. And if you aren't familiar with what a preference assessment is, that is a way to find out what different reinforcement systems work. And so you can identify different types of reinforcers and have them available. I always say when we talk about reinforcers, you can talk to the families and ask them what is going to be motivating, or ask the individual themselves what is reinforcing. And try not to use the number 1 or number 2 reinforcer during this time, because families are going to be needing those. I know for my own kiddos, those are kind of like we hold them very near and dear to our heart, what's going to work and what isn't going to work. But making sure that we have almost a toolbox of different reinforcers to use. And we'll talk in just a little bit about what we can do and how we can embed that into students' days, even if we are providing instruction remotely. So make sure you're utilizing preference assessments and identifying many reinforcers. And then the last major tip and trick I have is making sure that we're continuing to make database decision a part of your process. And I know that's really hard, but we're still going to have to show how we are tracking progress. So you can utilize simple data to make decisions about how your classroom is working and how you're setting up your remote or distance or virtual learning. You can track things such as how often students are checking in, or if you're face-to-face, what systems are working the fastest, or which mask, for instance, if you're face-to-face, is most preferred. So the data doesn't have to be complicated. Don't let it overwhelm you. In a time where there seems to be no right decision, hopefully the data will help you feel confident in the choices that you're making. And then for those who are working with older students, here are some of the things that might be successful or might help. As a teacher or instructor, you also might need to reach out to individual students to clarify certain expectations and rules for engaging during synchronous as well as asynchronous learning. Some examples would include how students should indicate if they have a question or comment. And for some students with autism, when we have, those communication and social barriers, that might be something that supports that student. If they have a specific direction on how they can ask a question or make a comment, or how many comments they can make. So being very black and white in how we are addressing those issues is going to be supportive of the student. It's also important to specify whether they're expected to keep their video on throughout a session. I know there's lots of great resources I have shown as to, or I have seen as to why we should not require video. And for someone with autism, it might be easier for them to turn their video off so that they are not as distracted by what's going on the screen and are able to better focus and maintain their attention. So that might be another conversation that you can have with the individual. Other things might be, do they leave unannounced? Do they have to stay by? Do they have to wait until everyone checks out and then leave? So really defining what the rules and how a virtual environment operates is going to be very supportive. Raising awareness of the subtleties during private conversations will be very, very appreciated by students. It really, like we said, we want to make things black and white. And when there's so much gray right now, anything that we can do to help clarify is going to be supportive. So take a look at these different questions, and hopefully these would be some good prompts that you might consider asking and talking with your students about. Or for those of you who are parents, these are different things that you can talk to your child about and ask them to initiate conversation or a private conversation with their instructors. Platforms. These are different platforms. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. I'm not going to go over too many of them. One thing I think is very handy is the Edpuzzle is helpful for those that are recording lessons and want to stop and embed some assessment into it. Another one that's really neat is Clever. Clever allows you to keep all of your students' passwords in one spot so that when the student goes to access all of these different platforms that they're utilizing, they don't have to remember their specific login or their specific password for each of those different systems or platforms. And so it kind of saves their passwords and they can click and go instead of having to enter all of that information. I know Loom is a new one that I'm not too familiar with, but I know a lot of the teachers that I've been working with have been very excited about using Loom. It allows you to embed your face, your video, on top of a almost PowerPoint. And so that is a new technology that I know has been very helpful to teachers. Here are some online learning tools. Boom cards, for those of you who are in the K through 12 system, boom cards are kind of a new thing. They allow instruction to be provided almost in that discrete trial format in an online setting. And if you sign up for a free account, you also have the I think they're still free. I think you have the ability to collect data on what the student is, the choices the students are making, and so you can get some instructional data that way as well. But listed here are other options. Nearpod and Pear Deck are great plugins to Google Slides. Well, Nearpod is its own platform, but Pear Deck is a add-on to Google Slides, and it allows you to increase engagement and how you're working and providing instruction with students. So you can ask questions, you can do different things where you can get feedback on how students are learning. And then there are some really good online digital activities right now that you can embed and allow students to gain control of a slide or the computer screen and be able to interact with you in. When we're thinking about different accessibility options, if you're not using Clever, it might be helpful for you to email each student a page or share within a Google folder a document that lists all of their logins as well as the passwords if they have been predetermined, and websites of where they can access information. Keep all of the virtual platforms simple and try to avoid too many different places to log in because that can be very confusing. And I know a lot of our districts and schools are doing a really good job getting hotspots to families or finding other ways, as described on the slide, of how to support families when there is limited internet access. Another thing to focus on are those routines and reinforcement. Always start simple. Focus on similarity. Make virtual learning as similar to classroom activities as possible. So use some of those. Start off with morning meeting. If you start off with morning meeting regularly, start off with morning meeting each day. Stick to some of those routines that have been successful for you in the past, and then use those same routines each day. So then you're making it routine-based. Which is going to help with independence for your students so that they're going to learn what this new virtual environment or new hybrid day looks like. You can also create a weekly routine so that you have Mondays are going to be this day, and these are the different activities that we're going to be. Tuesdays and Thursdays are different, and Fridays might be our asynchronous day where we're working on independently on different tasks. But anytime that you can create those daily routines and then also turn that into a weekly schedule or weekly routine, that is only going to increase over time independence in navigating what that day looks like for our students. And then I said I would talk a little bit more about reinforcement. Think about all of those different student interests. You can embed those YouTube videos, Go Noodles, Bitmojis, allowing students to change their background if you're using Zoom or some of the other platforms that allow you to do that. Those are all ways that we can increase reinforcement and engagement in these virtual environments. And anytime that we can embed that, I mean, the students love it, and we want them to enjoy as much as possible this new way of learning. And so we're also going to have to take time to build those relationships and build in reinforcement. The same is true of using a virtual reinforcement system. There were examples in that remote learning coping with COVID document for students with autism of how we can develop reinforcement systems. I'm working for boards, countdown strips, punch cards that we can use, so we can still utilize those same systems, but maybe we're doing it virtually now. And so maybe it is on a PowerPoint slide, or it is a note that we're using, and we can just assign different tokens or different points to students using this virtual system. But also that's where we're going to need to partner closely with the child care providers or families so that reinforcement, once earned, can then be delivered. So that wraps up the tips and tricks that I have for you. I hope you're walking away with at least one new idea of what you can do to support either your child or the students that you are working with. But then I want to take a few minutes and talk about what are your current needs and how can we help? So feel free to raise your hand and come off of mute, or put your question into the chat box.
So I'm not seeing any hands being raised, but we'll give it a few more seconds if any of you are ferociously typing to try and get your question into the chat box here. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions come through. I will let all of you know again that this webinar is being recorded, and tomorrow or the next day you should be receiving an email as a follow-up as being a participant, and this will give you information on where the recording can be accessed, as well as some additional resources that Nikki went over this morning. And if you have any questions that come up along the way, you can always reach out to Nikki or to ICSPS as well.
Again, thank you everybody for your time.
All right, thank you all so much. Have a great day.